Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, this week we have a guest who you may find his dulcet tones familiar. He is Douglas Brand. Now, Douglas has spent 35 years as a British police officer, of which around 23 were spent serving in the London Metropolitan Police, where he dealt with things like the Tottenham riots and the poll tax riots, IRA bombings, the fatwa of author Salman Rushdie, and royal protection, and lots more. He then became the head of the Force's Public Order Training Center before moving a little bit north in the country of England to become Deputy Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police. Meanwhile, he was representing the British police in the European Union and was orchestrated the creation, really, of the conflict management handbook used by all police groups in the European Union, and so on. So now Douglas has been working overseas in a variety of countries in post-conflict stabilization and various leadership development capacities. And he's also working on his PhD from Oxford University in police reform in Kenya. However, today, Douglas, we're going to call upon you to discuss the whole notion of policing by consent versus forced compliance in a crisis. How do you get the balance right in a democracy? So welcome, Douglas Brand.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Right. So let me just check in with you, since we're a couple of months into this COVID-19 pandemic on a global scale. Of course, that's what pandemic means. Just checking to see how you, your family are doing, and get your kind of point of view of state of play in the British Isles.
First, family's okay. We've had one or two sniffles, but nothing to worry about. So we're isolating at the moment. We have a category in the UK called shielding, which the government has identified vulnerable people or people who are very elderly, needing to spend much more time isolated away from others. So I'm nominated by my brothers to shield my 93-year-old mother. So that's what we're doing.
Aha. And across the country is the sense, especially since Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was in the intensive care and is now out, but he hasn't really resurfaced yet, has he? What's the sort of sentiment across the country with how things are going with the spread or mitigation of this disease, virus?
Well, it seems to me, and obviously I don't have access to sort of behind-the-scenes information, but based on open source information, there seems to be a pretty compliant mode, sort of a mindset that, for the most part, and I would say probably 90% plus of people are keeping their social distancing, doing their isolating, going out only when it's necessary, which is the way that our government set up these things. But of course, the little bit of the sting in the tail is that they gave police the powers ultimately to fine people if they were misbehaving or not following the directions, and ultimately to arrest them. So, there have been some incidents of fining, some incidents of arrest. coined a phrase over here already that is probably the small minority who we're now calling COVIDiots.
Oh. Interesting. Well, you always have had the football hooligans, so I suppose they might even come from the same camp. At least a good portion of them.
Yeah, I guess so. But I mean, on the serious note, one of the real challenges is to persuade people without alarming them or frightening them of the importance of following originally the guidance, now the requirements in law, in order that the bigger picture, that of protecting our national health service and reducing the threat of the spread of this disease, that being the self-isolation being a really important component of that. And I think, as I say, for the most part, the population generally have been compliant. So recently, the government's extended our period of isolation by another 3 weeks. So we'll wait to see whether or not at the end of that we can see any easing.
Right. So at least in England, I know you've got a history, more recent history in vivid memory of post-World War II with rationing and coupons into the 1960s. Of course, Winston Churchill remains in the public eye as a wartime leader and so on. I mean, there are a lot of people in North America, at least, who have never been through direct experience of war. And of course, they're trying to compare the fact that your parents, for example, went through a war. Of course, mine did too, because they went to Europe, but a lot of North Americans on the whole continent really are just having to stay home on the couch very difficult when prior generations went to war, dealt with rations and actual destruction of a post-war situation. Is there any talk of that in your country between generations?
That's an interesting point to raise, because there's the backcloth to that, of course, is that for those who experienced the austerity of war after the Second World War, have a much greater appreciation and probably an appreciation of how difficult times can be. If, however, you've never experienced that, and we also have to acknowledge that perhaps over the last couple of decades, there's been a growing increase in this state of entitlement and individualism, that some people can't necessarily equate the common good as being an important part of their contribution. Because it means that the rest of the country and the rest of the population can remain protected. So, when I consider, and I recall when I still had my ration book as a youngster, and that was after the war, the fact that the allowances were something like 1 egg a month, 6 ounces of butter a month, things of that nature. When you compare that, for instance, to, well, I haven't got my favorite choice on the supermarket shelf and I have to wait for 10 minutes to get into the supermarket, it's a bit of a distinct difference in terms of people's previous experience and therefore what their expectations are.
Yeah, for sure. Now, obviously, as I said in the introduction, you've worked all around the world in post-conflict situations. Are you finding differences in how the British, who are pretty much, and I don't want to use the word compliant to make them sound like they're lemmings going off the cliff, but they're much more willing to toe the line if it's for the common good. And in fact, look at how many signed up to volunteer. Wasn't it 775,000 volunteers to support the elderly and people in need? But I'm comparing that mindset versus a more authoritarian regime in countries where you've worked, for example, whipping people into shape or requiring them, with much harsher things than fines. From a policing perspective, any views on
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, because you're right. It's not about compliance in isolation. And I think if we also look to a country like Germany, one thing that Angela Merkel has done is to appeal to German values in the same way as we've appealed to British values in terms of that sort of what we would call the sort of the World War II solidarity, and you know, we sort of we combine our efforts to make sure that is maintained. And the appreciation here of the National Health Service, for instance, is quite unique, I think. But it's also revealed in the way that the police chiefs, or England and Wales, and was adopted by Ireland and Scotland as well, I believe, follows 4 principles that are incremental. So it starts off with the police encouraging people. It starts off by police engaging with people, and then providing some sort of education, and then some encouragement. And only at the last stage do they think about enforcement. Now, all of these things, of course, can't just be wished. It's that classic expression of, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. And so I took part, for instance, last week in a webinar which involved a very progressive, forward-thinking police chief from the United States. When it came to asking questions about partnership with other... Okay, so last week I was on a webinar with a very progressive, well-informed police chief from the United States, who'd done a lot of police in terms of the COVID situation. But when it came to a question relating to her engagement with other agencies, other public services, medical, social services, that sort of thing, there was a pause. And clearly that hadn't been a primary consideration. Now, the point I was making earlier on about fail to prepare and you prepare to fail means that what we've done here in the UK is to invest a lot of time in the good times in developing partnerships with other agencies so that common problems, common challenges can be dealt with in a collaborative way. And so obviously something like the virus is a major calamity of global proportions, but nevertheless it's going to be addressed locally. So I think that's one of the areas that is a useful lesson to pick up on, so that strategy I was talking about earlier on, about initial engagement, and then informing, educating, encouraging, and only then resorting to enforcement, has a fertile ground to develop if you've already invested that time. And it's based on, you know, values of the country and values of the law. And respect.
Right. Now, I know one of the quotes that you use often, because of your position of always being in rather extreme situations, and I may get it wrong, so correct me, but something like, in extraordinary situations, the application of ordinary solutions is bound to fail. So do you, correct me if I got it wrong, but also talk about that with what's going on now. Do you find that in the UK and elsewhere around the world, police and governments are treating this with the same old kind of approach?
Well, first of all, you've got a word perfect. Well done. Secondly, my fear is that we are applying the infrastructures of normality to a situation